Ah, kids' shows. They formed some fond memories for generations from the baby boomers and beyond. I'm sure we can fondly recollect getting up on Saturday mornings and turning on the television to find our favorite cartoons there waiting for us. That was a big part of many a childhood, I'm sure. When we grow up and have kids of our own, we'd like them to enjoy the same experience. Yet when we see some of the cartoons on nowadays, we're often appalled by the ugly, gross, and irritating nature of some of the shows that appear. We can hardly believe this type of programming is what's being put out for children. On the internet, reviews and critiques of these shows lay into them for their lack of substance and wit. However, there are defenders for these programs. These defenders aren't necessarily fans, but believe these shows don't deserve such heavy criticism due to their target audience. They say it's just a kids' show as a defense. I can understand where that defense comes from in some cases. True, there are some people that take things more seriously than they need to be and either aren't willing to suspend their disbelief and laugh, or expect kids' shows to be highly sanitized. Not all critics are like that, though, and I don't think that the people who criticize shows for being utterly gross and just plain stupid are being too uptight in their outlook. Defending these shows with the "it's just for kids" argument feels condescending. It's like saying kids don't deserve programming that's intelligently written because they don't have the capacity to enjoy anything with an ounce of value. I could probably refute this by talking about a Nicktoon or a Cartoon Network or Disney Channel show for children that has great writing and doesn't just pander to the lowest common denominator. But many of these shows had appeal beyond just their target age groups, intentionally or otherwise. So maybe it'd be too easy to use these examples in my defense. What I'll do instead is look at a show that's intended for a very young audience, and one of the most popular of such shows is Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. I grew up with this show and thoroughly enjoyed it when I was in preschool. I haven't revisited it in the past 20 years or so, but when my cousin's young son wanted to watch it with me, I was reintroduced. I was surprised by how well the episodes I knew managed to hold their own after all these years. They never got sappy or condescending, and they told many good stories. This could be because during my time with the show it was still adapting stories from the original Railway series by the Reverend W. Awdry. Even so, I'm taking one of these episodes as an example. The story I'm talking about is called Escape. It's based on the last two stories from the 23rd book in the Railway series, Enterprising Engines. The episode opens with Edward talking to Trevor the traction engine while Douglas rolls by with some coal trucks. He criticizes Edward for talking when he should be working, and this gets Edward a bit miffed. When he sees Douglas later, Edward tells him how Trevor has something in common with Douglas.
"Och, aye," quizzed Douglas. "And what'd that be?" "Scrap," said Edward quietly.
This revelation startles Douglas, and Edward says it does the same to Trevor. He relates the story of how he rescued Trevor from the scrapyard by convincing the vicar to buy him. Now, the threat of scrapping was a big part of the later books in the Railway series, especially in the Enterprising Engines book from which this story was adapted. When this book was published in 1968, British Railways had officially done away with steam engines. This meant many such engines were being scrapped. As you can imagine, that's a pretty grim prospect when you're an anthropomorphic steam locomotive. As depressing as that could be to young kids, Thomas and Friends conveys it well. I don't think this episode watered things down too much or went above and beyond what's acceptable for young children. It's treating the subject in a respectful manner. Edward's not bringing up scrap to offend Douglas, he's doing it to establish a relatable connection between him and Trevor. It's going to show how even old-fashioned engines can still be really useful. Then Edward tells Douglas that the Fat Controller needs another steam engine at work on his railway. Douglas agrees. Late that night, Douglas takes a goods train to another part of the island that is worked solely by diesels. As he's preparing his return, he hears something.
"That sounds like a steam engine," he thought. The hiss came again. "Who's there?" asked Douglas.
So now we get introduced to a new character. This is Oliver. He's a tank engine on the run with his brake van towed. He asks for Douglas's help after he learns he's one of the Fat Controller's engines. Douglas asks what he's doing, and Oliver tells him,
Escaping? From what? Scrap? Douglas shivered.
When Douglas remembers Edward's story about saving Trevor, he gets the courage and inspiration to do the same for Oliver. Now, the episode doesn't really talk about Douglas's backstory, but there is a connection to be made between his story and Oliver's. Like Oliver, Douglas was an escapee from Scrap himself. When Douglas came to the Fat Controller's railway with his twin brother Donald, he wasn't supposed to be there. The Fat Controller had only ordered one goods engine from Scotland. When he found out that he had received two, he couldn't tell which was the one he ordered, as the two engines had lost their numbers, and being identical twins, it was impossible to tell them apart without those. He didn't know that Douglas was tagging along with Donald so as to avoid being scrapped. What he decided to do was determine which of them he would keep by seeing who gave the best service. There were a few episodes dedicated to these stories in a previous season, including one that was never fully produced, based on the story of the missing coach, which you can check out for yourself, so I'll say no more about them. Anyhow, the plan Douglas and his crew come up with is to make it look like Oliver is being taken away for scrap by Douglas. They work fast, and then they set off.
Come on! But before they could clear the station, they were stopped.
A foreman tells Douglas and his crew they can't take Oliver and Toad with them. However, Douglas's driver tells him that they belong to them, and the foreman inspects Oliver. Now, this scene adds a bit of tension and suspense, as it gets the audience to wonder whether or not Douglas and Oliver can get away with what they're doing. It's moments like this that give dramatic stories impact and make the viewing experience more gripping. Even in a preschool show like Thomas and Friends, suspense and drama can be put to good use. The foreman lets Douglas and Oliver go, and the two engines set off back home. When they finally arrive in the early morning, they find a place for Oliver at the works. After Oliver thanks everyone, Douglas puffs to the shed where he tells the other engines about what he has just done. Gordon and James tell him to let the Fat Controller know, and as soon as his name is mentioned, he shows up at the sheds. Duck tells him that they need another engine, to which Gordon adds,
A steam engine, sir.
The Fat Controller tells them that the only way a steam engine would be available is if one were to be rescued from scrap. Douglas finally tells him that one has been. As it turns out, the Fat Controller was informed about Douglas's rescue effort and is willing to keep Oliver and Toad for use on Duck's branch line. A whistle-filled cheer is raised.
Everyone cheered.
The story ends by showing Oliver and Toad, now repainted in Great Western colors, at work with Duck on his branch line, which now goes by the name of the Little Western. Now I know what you're gonna say.
That's a baby show!
Yes, I know, Thomas and Friends is a preschool show. However, it's given us a compelling and dramatic story here that doesn't feel dumbed down or too intense for its audience. It just goes to show that no matter whom your audience may be, a good story shouldn't elude you. Thomas and Friends is by no means a perfect show. Having gone on for over 20 years under a few different showrunners, there are bound to be more than a few episodes, and possibly a few seasons, that are of substandard quality. Yet even today, it manages to be one of the best examples of a show that doesn't just pander to its demographic. It isn't the only preschool show to do this. There are several other such shows I could name as examples of series that treat their target audiences with dignity. And not all of them are purely story-driven shows either. Shows that educate children can have commendable value as well. Whatever the genre of show may be, as long as it's willing to put forth the effort to do what it's doing, it can succeed in more ways than one. I say this not only to kids' shows, but to adult shows as well. When a person finds their creative niche and aren't willing to seek high income or notoriety above everything else, great works can be created for generations to admire. Whether you're a child or an adult, everyone appreciates a good story or something impactful. There's something we can all learn from a show like Thomas and Friends. If you treat your audience as more than just an age group who will eat up anything you put in front of them, you'll gain more than just their attention. You'll gain their respect as well. And in the entertainment industry, I feel that that respect is better than any pure fame or fortune.